If I own gold or silver, how will I ever be able to spend it?
Oh, sure. Well, consider good times or bad times. Like in good times, you can sell it back to the same place you bought it from. sdbullion.com/RP will buy it back at the best price guaranteed on the internet. You can take it to a local coin shop and get cash in your hand, completely anonymous. Some people you know may be willing to take gold or silver coins in exchange for goods or services. Now, in bad times, when things have really fallen apart, time after time in history, people have found that in hard times, gold and silver really does come through as something that people recognize as value even after everything else has failed. Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/RP. Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions. This is a message of thanks and gratitude to all you amazing Reluctant Preppers who are making Reluctant Preppers possible by supporting our mission on Patreon. With your help, we're overcoming a 75% drop in YouTube earnings because you're not standing still, but are doing something about it and taking action by going to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers and pledging to keep us on the air. Now our team is 42 patrons strong and growing, and when we reach 100 patrons, we'll start sending out tokens of gratitude as a handwritten note from your host, Dunnigan Kaiser, and an autograph signed on a U.S. Silver Eagle to one of our patrons selected at random each and every month. If you haven't yet taken the step of joining in to support Reluctant Preppers, it's so easy. Just go to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers and pledge any amount you can. You guys are awesome, and we can do this together with your help at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. Did you know you can buy silver at spot price? Get your 10-ounce bar of silver at spot price today. Go to sdbullion.com/RP. Not only will you be buying silver without any premium, you'll also be supporting the independent media. Reluctant Preppers gets a small commission when you take advantage of this special offer, going to sdbullion.com/RP. That's sdbullion.com/RP.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're privileged to have a distinguished returning guest tonight, Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, author of numerous books on preparedness and home survival for the families, as well as fiction accounts of post-apocalyptic survival, and a NASA scientist and electromagnetic specialist, is here with us on Reluctant Preppers tonight, specifically to address the topic of debunking myths about EMPs, or electromagnetic pulses. Dr. Bradley, thank you once again for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Sure, thanks for having me on.
Hey, you've been studying quite a bit about ways that people can practically prepare for an EMP. In fact, one of your interviews on our channel about be prepared for an EMP is one of the most popular videos with sustained interest. So often when we post things on YouTube, there's a half-life of about a day in between declining numbers of viewers after the initial burst of newness is up, because it's such a medium where there's always something new grabbing people's attention. But your video that you did with us, the interview on being prepared for an EMP, has sustained and even built additional traffic over the months and over the years. We're having you back to talk about what are some myths, because especially with all the saber rattling and talk about North Korea conflict and so on that's going on, there's been a lot of information flying around the internet about the danger, real or otherwise, of electromagnetic pulses. So could you give us a quick summary of why you're qualified to address this topic, and then secondly, what are these myths that you're seeing about there, and can we debunk some of those with your help tonight?
Sure. So I have a PhD in electrical engineering, and I work for NASA, as you said. Now, I'm not representing NASA. I always have to tell people that, but that's my day job. I work in electronics for NASA. My background, I'm a certified electromagnetics interference engineer, one of a handful that work at NASA. And while my specialty is not electromagnetic pulse, I don't work in doing this kind of pulsing sort of things all day long. I do work with electromagnetic interference. In fact, I'm sort of the person called in that typically resolves problems that we have at the center relating to electromagnetics and noise and things like that. So I work in this area. I'm familiar with the general science behind it and also the testing techniques and that sort of thing. And so what I've tried to do over the last probably few years is sort of clean out some of the things that are out there on the web and put some facts behind things. I've done some videos to show some tests and what works and what doesn't work, and tried to offer some advice and some products that I think might actually help people. That's sort of my purpose right now in terms of this EMP field.
Sure. And as you've been exposed to lots of the information that is flying around the web about EMPs, there's more misconception than there is understanding out there. I have a bit of an advantage with a physics degree in my background, so I'm very familiar with how currents can be induced in conductors through moving magnetic fields, and it's interesting because it reminded me of one of the questions asked by one of the viewers is, are there only certain types of materials that can be affected by an electromagnetic pulse, and would a current or a voltage be set up in any material? And I think I can take that one as far as answering that it really does matter what the material is, and it's conductors we're talking about typically. And the analogy of why would an electromagnetic pulse cause a current to flow through a wire, the analogy that comes to my mind that always helps me is if you're sticking your hand out of the window of a moving car, everybody knows that feeling of the wind on your arm. But if the car is parked and the wind is still blowing, you're still feeling that feeling. So whether the car is moving you through still air or whether the air is moving past your still car, the point is there's relative motion between you and this flow. And if that flow happens to be an electromagnetic field that's changing and you're moving through it as a conductor, you're gonna get some energy in the form of current that can be set up in that conductor. And but if you could take us into some of the myths that you see flying around there that are really, because people want to take proper steps. They don't want to waste their time. Two ways. They don't want to waste their time making all kinds of over precautions that aren't necessary, and they certainly don't want to put their faith in some kind of a precaution that was not effective, and that they'd be sorely disappointed should some event occur and then they find out that their precious device that they wanted to have protected was not protected at all. So could you kind of give us a guidance of walk us through a list of what you consider to be some of the biggest myths that you want to set the story straight on? Sure.
Yeah. So I came up with I guess a little over a dozen or so of just sort of common myths, and we can talk to any of them at any detail level that you want. Since you have a background in physics, that helps a little bit too. So one of the first things is, I always start off all my preparedness talks and my books of having people sort of ask the question of why bother with this at all? Because if you don't have a really good reason of why you're bothering with it, you're either just doing it for fun or maybe you're doing it out of folly where you're really sort of chasing something that isn't worth, giving your attention and your money to. So I ask people to look at, each of these preparations that they take and say, is this really something I should be doing? In terms of an EMP, it's up to the individual, like a lot of things. It's a threat that we haven't seen manifested before. And so some people will discount anything that hasn't happened before. And so you'll see a lot of, if you get out there, you'll see reporters and other things saying, oh, don't worry about this, this reason or that reason. It really won't, it couldn't affect us. Nobody's going to do it. And then if you look, in other circles, you'll see lots of people predicting sort of the end of the world, that, if somebody detonates a nuclear warhead above the United States, it could take out our electrical grid for a year. And that really would cause life in our country at least, and maybe life in the world to change. No doubt about it. The loss of life would be incredible. And so you have to figure out where you fall in that spectrum. And I think the first thing is to answer that question, which is, is this a real threat or is this some kind of pseudoscience thing that's made up? And what I will say is, from a technical point of view, it certainly is a real phenomenon. They've known since way back in the very earliest testings in the 1940s that they had something called a radio flash. It was basically an electromagnetic energy release that happened when they did these nuclear detonations. And that occurred both when they did them on the ground as well as in the air. And so they knew that something was happening, but they really didn't have the science, the physics, if you will, to fully understand the mechanisms for it. And, of course, there were a limited number of tests. So it took all the way until, like, the early 60s, like 1963 or so nearly 20 years, for a guy named Conrad Longmire and some folks working at Los Alamos to sort of come up with a tentative theory that had the math behind it. of why this worked the way it did, and things called the source region and how that worked. And so they did come up with some science behind it. And indeed, it's been demonstrated many times by many countries that indeed it's a phenomena that if you detonate this warhead at the right places and the right altitudes, you can cause a tremendous electromagnetic pulse at the surface. And they know from experiments, and we can talk about this later, that those pulses can cause all kind of inherent damage in electrical power distribution as well as small-scale electronics if it's strong enough. And so the short answer, I think, to that is yes, it's a very real technical phenomenon. Yes, it could definitely cause widespread disruption. It's never occurred before. Do we have mechanisms in our country to defend against it? I'm sure we do. I'm sure we have ways of shooting down missiles. Would we be able to? I used to have a tremendous amount of confidence in our military defense until 9/11. When airlines start crashing into planes and we're not able to stop that even after the very first one. It makes you realize we're fallible just like everybody, and it only takes one time for somebody to get through, and then you've got a very serious problem. So I think the short answer to that is, yes, it's a real threat. I think it's worth something worrying about, and there are definitely a handful of countries that could issue this type of attack against the United States.
And beyond could it happen, what are some other myths that come up?
Yeah, so I'll skip the one about how serious it could be because I think I just sort of covered that a little bit there. We'll talk about some details of some of the effects. One of the key concerns right now, of course, is North Korea. And I watch this daily. I watch the news wondering where that's going. And as we all know, if we've been paying attention, they just recently demonstrated a hydrogen bomb, which was 120 kiloton. And so the question that comes up is, well, what if they put that same hydrogen bomb and they launched it over the United States and detonated it? Would that be enough to cause the kind of EMP we're talking about? And I had to do some homework to really answer that because most of the tests and the simulations are typically 1 to 2 megaton explosives, which is, on the order of maybe an order of magnitude larger than what they're showing. But what I discovered was that there were ways in which the bombs could be configured to release more levels of gamma radiation. And if you had more gamma ray release, you could cause a much stronger EMP with a smaller bomb. And so what I found, at least in terms of my research, was that it was in fact possible for even a 100 kiloton bomb to generate a very powerful EMP at the surface if the bomb had been designed specifically for that purpose. And there was an example that was back from, it's called Test 184 that the Russians did, and this was a long time ago, back in 1962, but they took a 300 kiloton bomb, which is a similar sort of bomb, and detonated it over Kazakhstan at the time, which was part of their region actually, but over a city, just to see what it would do. And it was not configured for those high-level gamma ray releases, but it still caused tremendous problems down on the ground, mostly through the large slow pulse that's released at the very end of it, the E3 pulse. It caught a power plant on fire. It destroyed a whole bunch of things, caused a lot of damage. And so it sort of showed that even for a relatively low, kilotonnage type of explosion, you could cause quite a bit of damage. And if it were optimized for it, you can imagine that you really could cause some significant trouble here on the ground. So I think the North Korea threat, while they have many other things in their arsenal that they could cause problems, I think the possibility of an EMP is real because, for one thing, it's one of those types of attacks where you don't have a city in flame, right? If you've bombed New York City, okay, it's game on, and within a few days, North Korea won't be a whole lot left in North Korea. But if you do something that's difficult for people to recognize, everybody's still alive and well, and there's just some malfunctioning happening, power's out, it's a different sort of reaction by the United States. People react differently to those sorts of things. So it's one of those weird attacks that a country might be able to actually pull off, cause tremendous damage to our infrastructure, and maybe even get away with it with little more than a slapped hand. So anyway, I do think it is a real potential threat from North Korea. I don't know if they have the ability yet to deploy that attack against us, but I do think it's something to be concerned about.
What about the question of whether an EMP could be detonated from an airplane?
Yeah, that question actually came up. I have a good friend who wrote a book, and in it there was an EMP, and in fact it was from North Korea, and he detonates a book. Detonates the bomb over the continent of the United States from a plane, and so I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, how possible is that? And there's really two things that work against that. The first is that there's a visual horizon issue. You have to have line of sight from the detonation. And so that means the higher up you go, the more line of sight you have. And so you typically want to be, a couple hundred miles into the air to get maximum coverage. And so the lower you get down, and you're talking about planes typically fly at about 36,000 feet, even U-2s only fly at 70,000 feet, which is about 13 miles. So if you start mapping those numbers, you end up getting a much smaller area of effect on the ground, perhaps only 100 miles or a couple 100-mile radius, certainly not the continental United States. And so the area of effect could be limited. You could detonate one, but the area of effect would certainly be limited by the line of sight. And the other thing is there's this thing called the source region, which is the area in which the gamma rays interact with the air molecules essentially and create these free electrons, which then propagate down, vibrate, disturb the magnetic field lines and cause this perturbation at the Earth. And you're actually just at the very bottom of the source region if you start detonating things at like 12 miles or so. So you're not going to get that same sort of magnitude of effect either. And so the short answer of it is yes, you would create an EMP if you detonated one from an airplane. In fact, you can detonate a bomb on the ground and generate an EMP, but you wouldn't get the widespread coverage, and you probably wouldn't get the strength of the field either. So I don't think it's probably a viable attack method to do it from an airplane.
And a lot of people have asked about the nature of things that will be affected by the blast. We talked a little bit about before, is it only conductive things, etc. People are asking about, what about electronic devices, electrical or electronic devices, but they're powered off? Does powering things off somehow protect them from an EMP?
Yeah, it does. In fact, it doesn't fully protect them, but certainly all of the studies that I have seen, and it's logical as well, is that if something is unpowered, you have to put some type of energy into the system to cause damage. And if you're already operating, you've already got some inherent energy and current flow in the system. And by adding more, you're pushing towards those upper limits that much easier. And so it certainly is true, for example, with automobiles, I showed with testing that, if the vehicle is running and everything is powered, it's much more susceptible than if everything is off. With that said, there's absolutely no guarantee that if equipment is off that it wouldn't be damaged. Certainly from the conducted pulse that gets generated after the EMP, maybe seconds later, that is a very high current, high voltage pulse that can force its way into electronics and cause all kinds of damage. So the short answer of it is, being off is certainly better than being on, but there's no guarantee if the device is off that it couldn't be damaged either.
People asked in your search for questions or for myths, whether people would be in personal danger of an EMP pulse if they were touching something metal or conductive.
Right. Yeah. So that's one of those. There's a couple that are really just sort of troubling but somewhat entertaining, and this was one of them. And that is that if a person, let's say had their hand on their car and was just standing there resting, and then an EMP went off, that somehow they would be part of a current flow that would electrocute them or something like that. And it doesn't work like that. You're not part of the conductive flow. What you're really doing is you're introducing, as you say, a redistribution of charge in that conductor temporarily from this perturbation of the electromagnetics. But you're not actually part of a high current loop or anything like that. And so you wouldn't feel it. You wouldn't get any kind of electrical shock. In fact, you wouldn't know it occurred at all. If you were far enough away, you might not see the flash. You wouldn't hear it. I mean, that was one of the problems with EMP in general is, it might have a range, let's say, of 800 miles. 800 miles away, you're not going to see it, and certainly if it's not if it's daytime, and all you would know is that things maybe didn't work anymore. Power went out, and maybe some things your car might not start, and things like that. But nobody would be in danger in terms of being electrocuted or shocked or anything like that. The
extensiveness of the impact on vehicles was another question that you addressed, such as, will all cars immediately just stop on the road, and will all trucks coast to a halt, and will all airplanes just fall from the sky?
Yeah, that's probably the question that people ask the most, I would say, and understandably so. We're a nation of people who drive their cars everywhere, unlike other places, and if we lost our automobiles, we lose a lot of our ability to fend for ourselves. And the answer is a little bit complicated. So automobiles are these sort of freestanding electronic things, right? They have all kind of computers in them, perhaps several hundred computers in them, and they have lots of little wires running all the way. Some of them, meters and meters long, and so they certainly have the ability, the length of those wires and so forth is certainly long enough to take in RF energy and perhaps damage those computers. So they certainly have that ability to do so. They're not so small that we don't think they could couple the energy. The good news is that most of them aren't plugged into the grid, so it's just a matter of what the radiated effects could do to the car. And so, as you know, I'm sure that there was an EMP commission that was sort of brought on to look at some of these various questions, and they did look at cars to some degree. And while they will be the first to admit that their investigation was not exhaustive, it did give some indications. And the indications were that cars in general, maybe around, we'll keep it very simple numbers, maybe around 10% of cars might have something that caused them to shut off. And so, your car would stall. And some percentage of those might not be able to be restarted. Some might restart okay, but they might have some anomalies in the dash and things like that. But the issue with their testing, and everybody will point this out, is that they weren't really able to test the cars at the full field levels. And so what they did is they borrowed all these cars from the motor pool, and they said, yeah, we'll test them, but we promise we'll bring them back and they'll be working. And then they put them under these simulators, the EMP simulators, and they would ramp up the value of the electromagnetic field until they started seeing anomalies. And typically that was not at full field. They always saw them beforehand. And then as soon as they saw anomalies, they said, okay, starting to be susceptible, we'll stop there. And so they showed that all the cars you could have some kind of anomalies, and some of them, like I said, would shut off and so forth. But they didn't take them all the way to the full field to see if they were permanently damaged. And so that's the big flaw everybody has with their test, is that, hey, why didn't you test them at 50 kV per meter and see how many of them would restart? And they weren't able to do that for cost reasons. They didn't want to have a bunch of damaged cars. So it's a bit of a buyer beware kind of thing. You have to decide what to believe. My personal feeling is that a good percentage of cars would stall on the roadways if they were running. And I don't know that number. Maybe it's a quarter of the cars running. And many of those would have trouble restarting and getting back underway. But if you imagine a scenario, if you will, being on the highway and 1 out of every 4 cars all of a sudden stopped and lost power, their power steering's out and all this, the amount of mayhem and chaos that would result from that is almost unimaginable. I mean, there would be so many acts. The roadways would just be completely impassable for a very long time. And that's sort of a best case of, maybe 1 out of every 4 cars goes haywire on you. So I think it's a real potential threat, but I don't think anybody knows the specific numbers. You will see a lot of people who say, oh, if you just buy a car or a truck before 19 whatever year, then you'll be fine. And there's no real basis for that other than that it is true they have fewer computer modules in them. They're less sophisticated. All that is true. So by a numbers game, you could say, well, then, theoretically it should be less susceptible. That is all true. But there's no proof. There hasn't been demonstrable, we're going to take 10 cars of this year and the 10 cars of this year and go our way down and see which ones work. So it's really more of an educated guess. And so I wouldn't put any particular credence in, I've got to get a car before 1981 or whatever the number is. Just sort of the rule of thumb is if a car is less sophisticated, it tends to probably be less susceptible to an electromagnetic disturbance. I think that's probably true.
Is there a level to which you could push that all the way back to where you've got some, a diesel vehicle that's, back in the 60s or something where it really would have next to none or no electrical susceptibility?
I don't know. It's a technical question that somebody would have to do a real analysis on to say. My gut would be no. I don't think so, because even freestanding generators, large generators, had been shown to be able to fry windings. You could put enough current through them that you could burn the windings. And I would just have to believe that even in an older car, there might be a place in the system somewhere where if you could flow enough current through it, you could cause some kind of overheating condition that would cause problems. So I don't know that there's a firm, absolutely this car would never be affected. But I'm sure it's less susceptible, but I wouldn't, without a lot of analysis, I don't think anybody could say that for certainty.
As far as people's attempts to try to protect, if you could talk about some ineffective protection attempts, there was a question you'd shared about people about saying tying your car to a metal ground rod or dragging a chain behind it, things that they've been, associated with static discharge, that sort of thing, will protect it from an EMP. Right.
Yeah. So that one's one of the more entertaining ones too. And I'm not knocking anybody because we believe what we read, right? And people look like experts, and they'll say things. So one of them is that there are people doing this who are literally, they strap a chain to the back of their car or truck and they drag it for the purposes they think of bleeding off this charge that must accumulate on the car during an EMP. And it's just a misunderstanding. I think they're thinking more of an electrical effect, maybe like lightning, where they're trying to discharge a large block of charge. And this isn't that sort of a phenomena, and trying to ground the car, if you will, is not going to have any effect on it. So dragging a chain wouldn't help. In the same way, I had a very nice email from somebody the other day, and it was a genuine question. He said, well, I've read this, and I just want to check to see if it's real. And what he had done is he had connected a large clamp to the bumper of his car and driven a ground rod in beside his carport, and had basically grounded his car just like you would ground a house or something like that. And the idea was the same idea, which is, well, if an EMP happens while I'm in my house, at least my car will survive from that. And again, it's sort of mixing up the concept of a lightning strike versus something like an EMP. Those don't really have any effect at all. The grounding doesn't. What really helps your car, if you want to protect a car that's not in use, is you really just have to shield the car in some way. And fortunately, and I did some measurements, most cars have some shielding anyway because most of them are built of metal, and it sort of acts like a little mini Faraday cage of sorts. It's not perfect, but it helps. So you might get about 10 dB of protection from your car's body. But if you really wanted to protect it, you can buy, and in fact, I just recently started offering something called EMP cloth. It's nothing magical. It's just conductive cloth. And you can make it into basically a large car cover, and you can drape it over your car, and it provides about 30 dB of additional shielding to a car, which is enough for a car to survive. I can't imagine any car being damaged if it was off and covered with 30 plus dB of protection. And I tested about 25 different kinds of cloth because I wanted to have is this the right kind of cloth? Which one does the best job? Which one won't, cause discolorations in metal and all these various things, and ended up with this cloth that's got stainless steel fibers in it. And I think something like that, whether you get it from me or anybody else, finding a conductive cloth and making a cover and covering the vehicle is probably the only effective way of protecting a vehicle from an EMP. And obviously you can't do that while you're driving, just when the car is parked and sitting somewhere.
I have to ask, because this is off topic, but it's a different topic that it might be of interest to many of our viewers, because there's been increasing concern as cancer rates are rising and other types of chronic disease, inflammatory processes and things are rising. Some people are convinced, and there are some doctors out there that are leaders in this discussion, talking about electrosmog that we're subject to, whether it's through our Wi-Fi routers or whether it's through smart meters on our homes, whether it's even through the current that's in the normal operating of our home, especially when we're at rest, and sometimes they say, especially for women, at night. Good if you can protect yourself from unnecessary exposure to electrosmog. Would something like the conductive cloth that you're describing, if someone wanted to go all out and create a sanctuary of their master bedroom, for example, if they made curtains of that, or if they use that as wallpaper, completely, can you make basically your whole master bedroom into a Faraday cage with the foreseeable consequence that you can't use your cell phone in there? Is that realistic?
Yeah, you can. In fact, that's what the cloth is primarily sold for. And that's exactly right. There's this sort of electrosmog that we get from all kinds of things. We get all kinds of RF energy that we are exposed to all day long, from radio broadcasts to power emissions, and like you said, smart meters. And there's lots of materials people have come out with to help block that. And some are more suited, like there's some that are very sort of thin and that you can drape over your bed. It's almost like a little, like a little netting type material. And then there are others that are made more for like a curtain type material. All of those I think are fairly effective at shielding. And they do different, you have to sort of look at what frequency bands they're for. But in general, that's what they're for, is to try and reduce this smog that we're exposed to. Now, the actual effects, the health effects, are sort of beyond my expertise. But I do know there's a lot of concern in that area. And there's been a lot of tests over the years of people measuring some of the effects that these might have on people. So it's certainly realistic. You can look out there for conductive cloth and find some for that particular application. You're not fully building a Faraday cage in a sense, because you're not wrapping yourself 360 with it. You're typically draping it over yourself or covering a wall or something like that to reduce the source. If you know where the source is, you're trying to sort of block the source with that conductive layer. But you could do any. I have built entire rooms that were Faraday cages where it just takes a lot of effort, because you got to do sort of all of the walls and the ceiling and the floor as well. But it certainly is an application of conductive cloth.
What about the question about the scale and size of devices, whether that makes any difference? People questioning whether small devices like a cell phone or a radio won't be damaged. Maybe it's only big things like the power grid. Yeah.
So it's a good question, actually, because certainly RF energy, high-frequency RF energy, couples better into, things that are long enough compared to its wavelength, right? So now an EMP is a complicated wave, right? It has these multi-pulses in time, but if you can break it down into these spectral components, and as long as you block the highest spectral components and the lowest spectral components, you can effectively block the pulse as a whole. But if you have, let's say, conductors that are, near the wavelength of any of those those potential energy frequencies, if you will, then it can couple the energy into your device. And if you look at it, even small devices like a cell phone have the possibility, if they have traces that are a few inches, they have the possibility of taking in some of that energy fairly efficiently. In general, small devices are much less susceptible to an EMP than larger devices because most of the energy is in lower frequencies and it doesn't couple into those devices very well. But with that said, the problem with cell phones and radios is that they have antennas on them and they're meant to pull in that energy. They're designed specifically to pull in that energy. And so what happens is even though they're very, very small, cell phones operate from 900 to about 2.1 gigahertz or so. That's right in the range of the EMP pulse, and so you end up being able to pull the energy into the antenna. And same way with two-way radios, you can pull the energy, or the ham radios. And so even though they're small many times, they're really like ideal. They're like just out there looking for the energy, and so you can damage them, in fact, with the pulse.
What about batteries? Batteries are a big deal to preparedness-minded folks. A lot of us are wanting to be less sensitive to the grid interruptions. In fact, I just remembered the last time we had you on, we were in the middle of a lightning storm and thunderstorm here, and right in the middle of our interview, I had to take a break and run downstairs because there was an alarm going off, and it was all of our battery backup, uninterruptible power supplies for our large tower computers, as well as our water-powered sump pump kicked in and all this stuff, and we had lost house power and rode right through it with our interview. But batteries are what carried us through to a large extent, and a lot of preparedness-minded folks store up batteries, in fact, lots of batteries, because they want to make sure that they'll have electrical power in the case of a grid failure. So what about batteries in the case of an EMP?
Right. So this was another one that you'll see both answers sort of out on the web. And there's really no mechanism that I can understand where conventional electrochemical batteries like alkaline batteries or car battery, gel cell batteries, those type of things could take any damage from an EMP. There's just not really a way I could see that happening. So I tell people, and I think all of the experts I've ever read tell people that batteries as a whole don't need to be protected. You don't need to put them in your Faraday cage or anything like that. Now, with that said, if they're part of a circuit where they've been wired into something like, let's say, a solar panel system or something like that, they become part of the problem in essence. They become part of that conductive path. But just freestanding batteries, your AA's and your things that are sitting without anything connected to them, I think they're perfectly safe through an EMP. The only exception, I add one little caveat to that, and that's that some of these modern batteries like lithium-ion batteries, that go in like laptop computers, for example, they have built-in circuitry in the battery housing itself. They have voltage converters and charge monitors and temperature sensors, all that sort of built in for safety reasons and to do the voltage conversions. And those circuits, in fact, could be damaged. And so the only ones I would say, sort of the caveat to it, is those sort of smart batteries, if you will, I think do have a possibility of being damaged.
All right. And in that discussion, you briefly mentioned solar systems, and that was another recurring question under the viewer-submitted questions. People are concerned. They want to be independent. They want to be self-reliant. They want to get off-grid. And the idea is, if I'm off-grid, I'm independent, nothing can affect me. But can an EMP damage freestanding, non-grid connected solar systems?
Right. And so to answer that question, I reached out to a company that was known as Solarc. I think they're out of business now, but they made an entire business, in fact, of making EMP-proof solar generation systems. So they knew they did EMP testing. They did some of the real details. And I called up the president of that company and spoke with him at some length to find out if first of all, did he know what he was talking about, or was this just marketing stuff? And in fact, he seemed to know. He knew the levels for an EMP, he knew what kind of tests had to be set up. And so in general, I take his advice as sort of the most practical advice I have. And his advice was this. He said that when he had small freestanding solar panels, things that were not connected to anything, in other words, they're just sitting in your garage, that those by and large survived the EMP radiated pulse. He couldn't guarantee that they would, but he said by and large they survived. As soon as they were connected up to any cabling like the charge controller and all that kind of stuff, they were damaged when he tested them with an EMP. They, in fact, took damage. Certainly the charge controllers did, but so did the panels, in fact. So what the company did is they went, and it was all very proprietary, but you can imagine they had pictures so you could kind of tell. They used ferrites on the power feeds going between the panels and the charge controller and over to the batteries as well. And ferrites are really just, a ferromagnetic material that you clip around the power feed that prevents the sudden change of current on those wires. They just sort of build up a magnetic field that doesn't want to change quickly. And so they suppress these pulses to some degree. And I suspect they had some other things inside of their charge controller itself. They probably had like maybe some TVSs or some kind of metal oxide varistors or some kind of things that would help clamp a pulse that might come in to sort of make it very EMP proof. But the short answer, I think, is that solar systems in general were proven to be susceptible to an EMP, less so if it's not connected and operational, which would make sense to me. I think there are reasonable ways of protecting it. If you have a solar panel that's fully operational, like it's outside in your yard or on your roof, I think the best you could do, obviously you have to have it exposed to the sun, so you're not going to cover it. The best you could do is probably put something on the power feeds. You can get ferrites. You want to get broadband ferrites. I offer these on my website as well for this purpose. But you can look for yourself and look around for ferrites that go onto the power feeds to help suppress those transients. And if you're more of a double E sort of person, electrical engineer sort of person, you could also get the right size metal oxide varistors or these voltage suppression diodes and put them into the system. I think that's a little trickier for people to do correctly. They could maybe do more damage than good if they're not careful. So I advise people to just start with the ferrites. It gives you some measure of protection. If you're not using the system at all, like you just got it, as a backup emergency system, a lot of people do, I would recommend that you either store it in a Faraday cage. If it's too big for that, get some of the EMP cloth or make your own Faraday cage. And if you get the cloth, you can wrap up the panels. It's very simple, and then unwrap them whenever you need them. Same way with the charge controller, either store it in a Faraday cage or wrap it up in some EMT cloth to give it some protection. So that's sort of my advice in terms of solar generation systems.
The question also you suggested was some myths have been out there about whether or not anyone with a pacemaker, a heart pacemaker, would immediately die in the case of an EMP.
Yeah, and I do not have a firm answer on that. I've written a couple of experts who have written in the area of pacemaker susceptibilities. And I don't have a pacemaker, so I'm not speaking from firsthand experience, but I understand their operation. And I guess there's in general two different types. And the newer ones typically are called bipolar. I think the other ones were unipolar. And the bipolar ones are much less susceptible to electromagnetic interference. And there's various reasons for that. It's the way in which the technology is done. And so the advice that I saw on the web was that modern bipolar pacemakers might take easily 900 volts internal to them without having any malfunction. And then even if they did exceed that, they would typically just power off. They had emergency systems in there that would just shut the thing off prior to damage. Now, whether or not it would work through a true broadband EMP, no one knows. Unless you tested it, no one would know that for certain. But the advice that I seem to read, and I read half a dozen different articles by medical doctors and other people, is that they thought they would very likely survive. The worst cases, they would probably shut off. Now, that might be problematic for some people who the pacemaker is literally keeping their heart going. But for other people, I think it might be a case where they could get back to a medical doctor and they could get the pacemaker restarted and so forth. So I don't think there's a firm answer on that. I think the good news is, everybody with a pacemaker is not going to just immediately keel over, as far as I know, and as far as I think most experts believe.
There was a related question, not about pacemakers, but about protecting devices, and that is, is a Faraday cage the only way to protect devices? In fact, there was a question submitted just less than an hour ago about somebody saying, could you bury something in a plastic pipe under the ground, or would that do it, or just even anything underground at all? What are the valid ways of protecting electronics?
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually. So there's a lot of confusion. Even at NASA, I talk with people all the time, and they sort of relate shielding with a Faraday cage. As soon as you say, we put shielding around this, you put it in a Faraday cage. And they're really different things. A Faraday cage really means a 360-degree enclosure around something where when you get an incident RF field on it, the free electrons redistribute on the outside of the Faraday cage and do a net field cancellation inside. And so inside doesn't see the field because of this charge redistribution outside of it. So that's sort of the way a Faraday cage works, and it's great. It works very wonderfully. But there are other ways of shielding, and the most obvious way is just putting something conductive between the transmitter and the receiver. If you took a large curtain of metal, like one of these EMP cloths, and you had an antenna that was broadcasting energy, and you just held the curtain in front of the antenna, everything downstream would get much smaller signals. And you'd go, well, why is that? I'm not putting them in a Faraday cage. And it's because things that are conductive have a couple of mechanisms by which they attenuate RF energy. They can absorb the energy and they can reflect the energy. And so any conductive layer that you put between something you're trying to protect and something that's trying to do damage to you will help to reduce those fields. And so that's oftentimes the way that we protect things, is we just put a layer of metal or some shielding between the offender and the receiver, and it ends up being enough to solve the problem. It's not a true Faraday cage, but it ends up solving the problem. And typically the levels, you can achieve 30, 40, 50 dB of protection if you do that properly. Now, in terms of burying things, that it really is a similar application. The earth, of course, is a modest conductor all around it because it has a lot of moisture in it. And in fact, it's a great question of, hey, could I just dig a hole, put things in a plastic tube or something, and put them down in a hole? And you could do that, in fact. But I ran some numbers. I did some calculations on the sort of the characteristics of Earth, and there's some interesting articles out there. And it shows that to get a reasonable skin depth, in other words, where you're buried below where most of the free charge will be moving around, you'd have to get at least a few meters, even in the best case. Maybe the best case is a couple of meters, and the worst case might be tens of meters down if you had very dry soil, before you're sort of below where those electrons that are moving around would affect your electronics. So I don't think it's a very effective way. I think it's, if you have a bunker already, sure, you're going to gain some advantages by having stuff down in your bunker. That's sort of a freebie. But the idea of maybe going out in your yard and digging a hole with a postal digger or something and putting things in there, I don't think you're going to get much benefit, and all of the other risks of putting things in the ground come into play. So I don't think it's a great way of trying to protect things. And
the question arose about needing to build your Faraday cage out of something that was really thick, because aluminum foil or a thin conductor, mylar coated bag, that sort of thing, would just melt. True or false?
Well, that's my favorite of all of them, in fact, because I read that and I thought, well, that's crazy. My first reaction was, that's crazy. And then I started thinking, well, why is that crazy? Is it just because it's crazy because I think it's crazy, or is it really crazy? And so I started doing a little bit of research, and so I ran the numbers a little bit. I wanted to know for certain, is this even reasonable at all? And so if you look at the total energy density of an EMP, and you can look at that, people have run calculations, it's really only on the order of about 0.1 joules per square meter, which is not a lot of energy. Now, it's generated essentially very, very fast in nanoseconds kinds of time. The peak only lasts very, very brief. But by knowing that amount, you can start looking and you can say, all right, well, let's say I had a sheet of aluminum that was 1 meter square, like a piece of aluminum foil. And you look at the specific heat capacity of that aluminum, and it takes about 0.9 joules per gram per degree C. So in other words, every 0.9 joules I put into a gram of aluminum will raise its temperature by a degree C. And so if you look at that and you say, all right, how much does this little square of aluminum foil weigh? So I made a 1 meter square and weighed it on my scale. It's about 40 grams. And I said, okay, 0.9 times 40 grams is about 36 joules. I need to put 36 joules of energy into a 1 meter sheet of aluminum foil to get it 1 degree hotter. And so the bottom line is, if I'm only putting 0.1 joules per square meter and I need 36 joules per square meter just to raise the temperature a degree, I'm not going to have any temperature effect on the aluminum foil whatsoever. And so the idea that you're going to suddenly melt the metal, there's so much energy that you're going to start melting metal, really is absurd. I can confirm that that's absurd. Nobody's going to melt any metal from the EMP.
So there really is a big difference. And in the analogy I was making in the beginning of sticking your arm out the window of a moving car through a moving field, that kind of thing, moving conductor through an electromagnetic field, was more what people may be familiar with when it comes time to how electric generators work with conductors moving through a magnetic field or vice versa, that kind of thing. But you're talking about something quite different here when you're talking about nanosecond bursts of energy and how they couple in depending on the geometries of the conductors, that sort of thing. Maybe if you could just take a brief second to just to help people understand, kind of in layman's terms, what is so different about an EMP, say, because they've seen lightning protection systems where lightning went through something and it melted the heck out of something because there was so much heat was developed with this huge current that has to flow in a very short period of time. Right. Yeah. Right. So, it's a very different phenomena, right? So lightning is really an electrical breakdown phenomena where you have a very large potential built between, if you want to think about it, sort of two plates, right? The Earth is one plate and the cloud structure is another plate. And you generate, megavolts of difference between these two plates, and you end up breaking down the air and causing vast amounts of current to flow down through this conductive path once you've created this breakdown. And if anything is in the way of that path of current flow, it in fact does get very, very hot very quickly.
and can melt, and so you see trees burned and other things damaged by electrical lightning strikes. But it really is the discharge of a vast amount of energy, and it's also quite brief. It's not as brief as an EMP, but it's different in the sense that you're taking a huge body of essentially free charge and transferring it from one plate to the other, and that has to go through whatever it is you're transferring through, and so you're going to end up with some heating effect from that. It's a little different than like this RF sort of electromagnetic perturbation, which is what the EMP is doing. We're not doing an electrical breakdown phenomena with the EMP at all.
The next one was about what materials are effective. We just said that, okay, maybe aluminum foil could be effective, potentially. What about chicken wire?
Yeah, so I went out on YouTube and I see a lot of posts about, well, let's build our Faraday cage out of chicken wire. And my first reaction was, well, that's probably not going to be very effective. But again, it's one of those questions that you just have to test to be, if you're going to debunk something, you want to run the test. And so what I did is I did a video, in fact, on YouTube where I build a Faraday cage out of aluminum foil. It's just a very simple aluminum, box with aluminum foil around it. And then I do the exact same box, the exact same measurements, but with standard 1-inch chicken wire. And I bought it at Lowe's and built it up. And people can go and watch that test themselves. And basically what you see is that as you test at high frequencies, the holes, of course, in the chicken wire allow the RF energy to come in fairly efficiently. And so what happens is that I think I tested at 100 megahertz, which is not that high. And so at 100 megahertz, the chicken wire Faraday cage only gives you about 20 dB of protection. You can actually see the signal come up through it. The spectrum analyzer is inside the box, and it's visible, so you can watch it come up. Whereas when you have it with the aluminum foil wrapped around it, it drops so small. It's at least 50 dB. It drops so small that it falls into the noise floor, and you can't see the signal at all. And so the message is pretty straightforward, which is if you're going to build a Faraday cage against an EMP, which is a broadband event that goes all the way up to a gigahertz, you really want a solid conductor or a very fine meshed conductor. No hole on the conductor should be larger than a millimeter. And so that's about the thickness of a dime. And so if you have a really fine mesh, it will do fine. But if you have something like chicken wire, as you get up higher in frequency, it's just not going to do very well shielding, and so I don't recommend that.
Now, you are the author of a book, Disaster Preparedness for EMP Attacks and Solar Storms. In the solar storms part of the question, what myths are out there that need to be set straight as far as what's different about, is anything that will protect you against an EMP also going to protect you against a solar storm and vice versa? Yeah,
so there is some overlap, and I've tried over the last few years to sort of get people in the right camps about this. There's certainly a solar storm or a solar event could cause big problems on the Earth. The biggest threat it really causes, though, is to our electrical grid, because solar storms cause these geomagnetic disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field lines, and they couple into very large, long conductors, things like power lines, that go from state to state, or buried underground transmission lines, and things like that. Oil and gas pipes and things like that. Very long conductors are what build up these currents that can cause damage. And then those currents flow in through the control systems or through the transformers and cause major problems. And so the idea is that if you had a large coronal mass emission from the sun, it could cause a big disturbance here at the Earth and, in fact, take down the electrical grid. And I think it's a real threat. I think it's something that even the electrical industry has recognized as a threat. We have satellites that watch this sun, so we know when these coronal mass emissions happen. They don't flow at the speed of light. They're not like flares, which basically by the time they hit the Earth is the same time you know it, that they just happen. But these CMEs you can see coming. They usually know about a day ahead of time. It's coming our way. What they never know precisely is what effect it's going to have and how strong it's going to be here at the Earth's surface. And so most of the time, the industry just decides, we think it's okay, we're just going to weather it out. And it's certainly possible that an event could happen where folks here on the Earth say, yeah, we think we've got enough protection, and in fact we didn't, and it started causing widespread blackouts and causing damage to some of these large transformers. I think that's a very real threat, and it's similar to an EMP in the sense that they both could take out the electrical grid. The difference is there really is no very high frequency pulse that comes from the sun. So you don't have this E1 event. You don't have these things that would couple into like cell phones or cars. Cars will never be damaged by a solar storm of any sort. It's only those things that are attached to those very long conductors that get affected. And so I always tell people, if you're putting things in a Faraday cage to protect from a solar storm, you really don't understand what you're protecting against, because, again, those things are not susceptible. It's the things that are plugged into the electrical grid that are susceptible, and you're not putting those in the cage anyway. So there is a difference in terms of the threat, but there's also a bit of overlap between them as well.
A related question someone asked was, could you protect your house by having the power come into your house through a industrial-sized transformer? Is there anything you can do? And that sounds like it might have more to do with the pulses coming over the grid than something like an EMP, because an EMP, right, is going to affect everything no matter where it's located, not only things that are connected to the house. But could you talk to that basic question? Is there any hope that people have, either for a solar storm or a lightning event or EMP, of putting a large transformer on the line coming into their house?
Yeah, so lightning has its own set of protections, which is typically the best way to protect against lightning is to have some kind of arrestor that when that energy hits the home, it gets synced down into the earth. And so there's a rod buried beside the house that's tied to the point that's most likely to hit and so forth. But in terms of an EMP and a solar storm, the big threat to a home, certainly from an EMP, you can get energy into the home even if you weren't connected to the grid. So you could still cause things to be damaged. But a big threat is certainly through the conducted pulse that would come in through the power lines. And I do believe it's possible to have some level of protection from that. I don't know that transform would be the way to do it, but you could certainly have some level of protection, maybe with some type of fusing or breakering, especially if you could get something that went fairly quickly. Because remember, it's not the E1 that's going to get on the power lines and cause this big surge of current. It's really the E3. This latent pulse, this thing that could stretch out for 20, 30, 40 seconds, right? Many seconds. And breakers, if you get a good fast blow breaker, it might see that surge in time to open up your house circuits from the general power system as a whole. So I think there is some methods by which you could protect your home, but it's not a guaranteed thing. There's still this E2 pulse, which is a sort of modestly fast pulse that could come in and do damage. And then there's the question of, breakers are inherently very slow. A lot of them are thermal. They have to sort of heat up over time to blow. So you'd have to do a bit of homework. I think somebody would have to really sort of study, how fast does it need to go, what levels would cause it to blow. And you don't want it to be too susceptible because we get transient surges all the time on our power grid, and we don't want our house, kicking off all the time and everything in the house resetting every time something happens to the power grid. So I think it would require a little bit of study, but I do think there is a possibility that there might be some whole house methods, if you will, of sort of putting something at the front end of your power line that might open up in time to prevent much of that E3 energy from coming in.
One last question. In the principle of preparedness, where the saying goes that 2 is 1 and 1 is none, as far as what you have, tools that you have stored and at the ready, people have talked about the devious minds. And when you were on talking with us about scenarios such as North Korea scenarios in our last interview, you talked about you have to put your nasty hat on and think about it. If you were trying to really cause mayhem, how would you do it? And people have written, don't be too complacent and smug, thinking, well, I've got a few important things in a Faraday cage, and once everybody gets knocked out with the EMP pulse, I'll just open my Faraday cage and I'll be the guy in town who's still got stuff that works. Because they're saying the guy with his nasty hat on will probably send a second pulse a day or 2 or 3 later to really do the kill shot and knock out everybody who then opened their Faraday cages after the first one. Is there any sense in people taking, if they want to take prudent precautions, that they might want to not put all their eggs in one basket?
Yeah, I get that logic of being sort of double prepared and looking for the second threat. We used to always have the saying when I would take these shooting classes, if there's one shooter, there's 2 shooters, right? So you always assume there's another one around the corner. And I think that's a very real preparedness mindset to have. I think it's a good one to have. In terms of an EMP, though, my thought is this. If a rogue nation, let's say North Korea, detonated an EMP, the vast majority of the effect would be felt from the first EMP, and the return on their investment of trying to get another one employed without getting it shot down and all of that would be much, much smaller from a second EMP. The military systems that survived the first one would still survive the second one, and on and on. And so while, yes, theoretically they could get, some of the people who were prepared now get some of their equipment, the grid might already be down. I just don't think there's enough return on to think that would be their second punch. I think that a really devious, nasty person would strike with the EMP and then strike with something else different, because you always want somebody to look one way when you're going the other way, right? And that's the way I really think North Korea has the ability to do that sort of 1-2 thing, get everybody looking at one threat and then come in with a second threat when you're not paying attention to it.
Dr. Bradley, for those who want to find out more of your work, where's the best place for them to start? Yeah,
so I would recommend they just go to my website first, which is disasterpreparer.com. They can also just search Arthur Bradley Disaster on the web, and I'm sure I'll pop up. I have lots of books on Amazon and stuff like that. In particular, if they're looking for products to protect against an EMP, they can go to that disasterprepare.com, and they'll find there's some EMP cloth and some ferrites, and my book is on there as well, and some EMP bags, which are great for sort of really quick storing of items in Faraday cages.
Well, we have been speaking with Dr. Arthur T. Bradley. He is a NASA engineer and scientist. He is a specialist on electromagnetic interference. He's been with us here following up on his previous talk, which you can find in our archives, people, under how to prepare for an EMP. This talk, EMP Myths Debunked. Dr. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, Reluctant Preppers. If you haven't heard, we've already started our monthly 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle thank you gift to one active Patreon subscriber each month, signed by your host, Dunnigan Kaiser. And you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.